Hi guys, in this video we're going to talk about the origins of Lukashenko's dictatorship and the Belarus revolution. A revolution is taking place in Belarus, but while most of the media is focused on the ongoing protests, not enough people are talking about what life was like under Lukashenko's Soviet-style dictatorship. Why are Belarussians dissatisfied, and what underlying factors beyond the rigged election led to the protests? What role did Russia play in the country's internal politics? And how can we expect the Belarusian revolution to develop? All that in this video. Just before we start, don't forget to subscribe for more political analysis videos every week and hit that bell notification while you're at it. So let's do a quick recap of what's happening in Belarus. As most of you already know, Belarus is experiencing a wave of protests against President Lukashenko in response to the rigged election results. These protests are bigger than anything Belarus has ever experienced. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya emerged as the main opposition candidate after other candidates were barred from running, including her husband, Sergei Tikhanovsky, a popular politically active YouTuber. Tikhanovskaya's rallies began to attract tens of thousands of people, and a poll in April showed that just 24% of people in Minsk trusted Lukashenko's leadership. And so in the run-up to the election, Lukashenko already began setting up ways to subvert the election. Foreign journalists were banned from the country, her husband Sergei was arrested, and Tikhanovskaya received death threats against her family. When online polls showed Lukashenko with as low as 3% support, all unapproved polling was banned, and foreign observers were not allowed to observe the vote count. Then, days before the election, the government announced that it had uncovered over 200 mercenaries from the Russian Wagner group who were allegedly there to destabilize the country. But the government didn't mobilize the military or close the border or take any other measures and seemed strangely calm. On top of that, the mercenaries were walking around openly in full military gear, hardly an attempt at subversion. More likely, this was a false flag operation to justify further suppression and an external diversion to present Lukashenko as the savior of Belarus from external forces and to tap into anti-Russian sentiment. And so unsurprisingly, Lukashenko won 80% of the vote. This triggered immediate mass protests. Facing threats from the government, Tikhanovskaya first called on people to recognize Lukashenko's victory and to stop protesting, before she fled to Lithuania. The protests were met with horrific acts of police brutality, which only caused the protests to intensify. While before the election, he was talking about Russian intervention, he now blamed the protests on Western intervention. Lukashenko tried to organize his own counter-rallies, which were totally eclipsed by the hundreds of thousands of people protesting against him. He then tried releasing protesters from jail who had been viciously tortured by the police. At this stage, his core support base, factory workers, went on strike, demanding his resignation. And when he tried to talk to them, he was shouted down. He even offered constitutional changes to calm down the protests. But as the protests intensified, with Tikhanovskaya calling for new elections and for Lukashenko to step down, Lukashenko moved from trying to negotiate to brandishing guns and making threats. Russia, which initially tried to remain neutral in order not to alienate Belarusians, declared that it would support Lukashenko with a reserve police force if things got out of hand. While the EU condemned him and announced targeted sanctions on top Belarusian officials. As we speak, emboldened by Russian support, Lukashenko has begun a massive crackdown, arresting opposition members, kicking foreign journalists out of the country, and sending in secret police. But that analysis is shallow. Belarus has always had rigged elections, and this exact scenario has played out several times before in Belarus. And so to understand the current situation and how things will develop from here, we need to understand the nature of Lukashenko's dictatorship, as well as its relationship with Russia. Belarus is a very different country from other post-Soviet countries. Unlike other post-Soviet nations, Belarus does not have a distinct cultural identity. Despite the fact that 83% of the population is ethnically Belarusian, only 10% actually speak Belarusian on a daily basis, with the majority speaking Russian and being heavily Russified. On top of that, Belarus benefited disproportionately from Soviet-era industrialization programs. And so when other countries were breaking away from the Soviet Union, there never was a strong nationalist movement in Belarus. In fact, in a 1991 referendum, 83% of Belarusians approved a renewed union with Russia. The lack of a strong anti-Soviet movement meant that Belarus was slow to implement reforms, and so Belarusians got to see the economic and social chaos that came with rapid privatization of the economy in other post-Soviet nations. Inflation, unemployment, the rise of oligarchs and the mafia. The fact that Belarus had a lot of large-scale industry meant that privatization would lead to mass unemployment. This, combined with the lack of any strong cultural identity, produced a deep sense of nostalgia for the relative stability and prosperity of the Soviet era. And so when Belarus finally held its first democratic election in 1994, people could already see the economic turmoil caused by the collapse of communism in other post-Soviet states. So Alexander Lukashenko, an upstart parliamentarian, presented himself as a pillar of stability and continuity with the past. He would not force change. He would keep the factories open, and he used Soviet-era nostalgia to gain support. And so he won the first round of the presidential election with 44% of the vote and won 81% in the runoff. And that would be the last democratic election Belarus would ever have. One man, one vote, one time. Lukashenko quickly moved to consolidate power, organizing a referendum in 1996 to grant himself increased executive powers, and another one in 2004 to abolish term limits. Opposition leaders mysteriously disappeared, journalists were arrested, and every election was rigged. And if we look at the situation today, this scenario has played out before. In 2006 and 2010, there were opposition candidates who challenged Lukashenko. Both times, opposition leaders were arrested. Both times, protests broke out against rigged elections. And both times, they were crushed. These actions caused Western countries to shun Belarus, and so Lukashenko had no choice but to double down on Belarusian Soviet identity and close relations with Russia. And so Lukashenko has maintained much of the symbolic and economic infrastructure of the Soviet Union. 80% of the population works for the government, and what little private enterprise there is heavily regulated. Now, this isn't born out of a principled commitment to Soviet communism. Instead, it's a means of control. Speaking out against the government means losing your job, especially since the government is virtually the only employer. On top of that, state control over industry is a way for Lukashenko to easily distribute benefits to his supporters and facilitates the extraction of resources by the elites. And when it comes to culture, Lukashenko retained the symbols of the Soviet Union, even banning the use of the red and white pre-Soviet Belarusian flag in favor of the red and green that is similar to the old Soviet-era flag. A pro-Soviet curriculum was taught in schools, and he actively discouraged the use of the Belarusian language. By undermining any kind of Belarusian national identity, Lukashenko ensured that the existence of Belarus itself depended on him personally. Lukashenko was Belarus, and Belarus was Lukashenko. But it wasn't just in culture, but also in foreign policy that Lukashenko aligned with Russia. The Belarusian economy is heavily dependent on Russia. Most of its exports go to Russia, and the country depends on Russian energy subsidies for cheap gas and oil. But more than being pro-Russian, Lukashenko above all is pro-Lukashenko. And so when Russia proposed a union state with Belarus, with a common currency and a shared parliament, Lukashenko was on board with the idea when it suited him, and ensured that it never materialized when it didn't suit him. Despite being so-called pro-Russian, Belarus and Russia have had multiple disputes over gas prices and foreign policy. Lukashenko is only important to Russia because Lukashenko ensures stability, and because Belarus acts as a buffer state to Russia, and because Lukashenko is the only realistic candidate to run Belarus. But after the revolution in Ukraine and Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, things changed for Lukashenko. Suddenly, he realized that the presence of a Russian-speaking majority in Crimea was one of the main reasons that when Russia occupied Crimea, there was little resistance. With a Russian-speaking majority in Belarus, Lukashenko feared that the same could potentially happen to him, and so he immediately switched policy. Instead of promoting Soviet nostalgia, he embraced Belarusian nationalism and began encouraging the use of the Belarusian language, allowed the use of the red and white flag, and positioned himself as the defender of Belarusian sovereignty. Instead of being unabashedly pro-Russian, he decided to pursue a more neutral foreign policy and tried to end the dependence on Russia by pursuing relations with China, the EU, and America. He would act in favor of Russia in some areas, like joining the Eurasian Economic Union, but he also opposed Russia in other areas, like refusing to recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia, two Russian-backed breakaway states from Georgia. And so Belarus was slowly moving away from Russia when this year's protests broke out and when Lukashenko accused Russia of sending in the Wagner mercenaries. This reduces the chance that Russia will intervene on his behalf, and that has implications for what could happen next. So where do things go from here, and what is the way forward? Well, there are several possibilities. It could be that this plays out just like it did in 2006 and 2010. Lukashenko launches a brutal crackdown and the protests fizzle out. And in some ways this is already happening. Over 200 opposition activists have been arrested. Russia has said that it would support Lukashenko with a reserve police force if things get out of hand, and Lukashenko has abandoned his conciliatory tone in favor of brandishing guns and making threats. So this is a very likely scenario. But there are some things that are different. This time, the protests are much larger than in 2006 and 2010, and have already lasted longer than they did back then. The people have lost their fear and won't back down. So even if Lukashenko manages to crush the protests, he will have totally lost any sense of legitimacy, and his regime will remain incredibly weak. On top of that, Lukashenko botched the response to the coronavirus, completely denying that there even was a pandemic, and telling people to drink vodka and play ice hockey to cure coronavirus. This total abdication of responsibility and the economic fallout from the virus has turned people against him. Before this, Lukashenko did have some support from older people, rural people, and the less educated who valued the stability and social benefits provided by his regime. That is gone now. The other scenarios really depend on Russia. Russia's primary goal is to maintain stability and make sure that whoever is in charge is at least somewhat pro-Russian. A total invasion of Belarus is unlikely, as it would cause chaos, turn the Belarusian people against Russia, and cause the West to impose even more sanctions. But letting Lukashenko be violently overthrown is also a no-go, as that would create instability and most likely result in a pro-Western leader taking power. The best scenario is if Russia agrees to facilitate a peaceful transition of power and convinces Lukashenko to retire in Russia. But this is not likely and will only happen if Putin believes that Lukashenko will fall and his replacement will not be pro-Western. And so it's critical for Tikhanovskaya to forcefully argue for a neutral foreign policy to reassure Russia that this is not just another Western-backed revolution like in Ukraine. The EU will have to do the same by guaranteeing that it won't allow Belarus to join the EU or NATO, while also making clear that if Russia intervenes on behalf of Lukashenko, they will face sanctions. And there is a precedent for this. In 2018, Armenia had a democratic revolution against its corrupt Russian-backed leader. However, the new democratic government remained pro-Russia, and so Putin did not intervene to keep him in power. The Armenian solution is needed in Belarus. If the EU or NATO try to push Belarus to the west, Belarus will become a geopolitical playground, and it will be at the cost of the Belarusian people. To learn about the future of the EU after coronavirus, check out my last video. Thank you to my Patreons for making this video possible. Like, share, and subscribe, because this was my take.